3 ships vanished from satellite view, a pipeline stalled mid-delivery, and by morning, oil prices had spiked 11%. The Kamchatka disaster didn't just shake the ground, it fractured the arteries of global movement quietly, instantly, and with consequences no one was ready to track. Within hours, supply chains cracked, sea lanes closed, commodities surged, and nations scrambled not just for rescue, but for rerouting. Kamchatka's geography might seem remote, a volcanic peninsula tucked along Russia's Pacific edge, far from major capitals or industrial zones. But it is precisely its position, wedged between the North Pacific and Arctic maritime routes, that made the quake more than a geological event. It became a global disruption engine. The first wave hit the sea, but the second wave hit the markets. Commercial shipping from East Asia to North America relies heavily on the Bering Sea corridor. It's a quieter path than the Panama Canal and faster for northern routes. Vessels carrying everything from microchips to frozen fish were passing through when the earthquake struck. And suddenly, the seafloor shifted, literally. Underwater fiber lines snapped, ports shut down, and captains receiving uncertain tsunami advisories rerouted thousands of tons of cargo mid-ocean. Within the first 12 hours, AIS signals, automatic identification system, from over 300 vessels went dark in the region. Some ships turned back toward Vladivostok. Others anchored far off the coast, waiting for updates. Satellite imagery revealed traffic jams in the northern Pacific, not seen since the early pandemic chaos of 2020. But this wasn't just about delays. For liquefied natural gas LNG carriers, the consequences were immediate. Several Russian-operated LNG tankers heading toward Japan were forced to halt. Energy traders reacted fast, fearing a longer-term disruption to LNG flows, especially amid Europe's continued energy insecurity. Prices jumped. Futures contracts soared on the Tokyo Commodity Exchange. South Korea released emergency reserves to stabilize domestic supply. And in the EU, officials initiated scenario risk assessments, fearing ripple effects through already tense winter contracts. By day 2, the fishing industry was also in disarray. Kamchatka's waters are among the world's richest for salmon and crab exports. Russia's Pacific Fleet, based partly in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, was grounded. Processing plants lost power. Refrigeration facilities along the coast failed. Thousands of tons of catch risked spoilage. International buyers, particularly from China and Japan, faced cancellation notices. And seafood futures, up 14% in 48 hours. But perhaps the most alarming impact was the vulnerability of undersea data cables. Kamchatka sits along one of the trans-Pacific backbones of global internet infrastructure. The earthquake severed at least 2 known lines, temporarily isolating sections of eastern Russia and slowing data traffic between Asia and North America. Financial institutions in Singapore and San Francisco reported packet loss and latency spikes. High-frequency trading systems, reliant on microsecond timing, flagged transmission delays. For some digital markets, it was a barely perceptible hiccup. But in the world of algorithmic finance, milliseconds mean money. A Japanese telecom executive speaking under anonymity admitted, "We never really planned for Kamchatka." And that was the real story. No one did. In a world obsessed with choke points like the Strait of Hormuz or the Suez Canal, Kamchatka was a blind spot. A place known more for volcanoes and remote wilderness than for critical infrastructure. And yet, within hours, it revealed itself as a fulcrum, leveraging disruption far beyond its icy coast. Insurance firms were next. Lloyd's of London placed provisional clauses on vessels within the seismic zone. Reinsurers flagged Pacific coastal ports as high volatility zones. One firm estimated potential claims above $3.2 billion, depending on how fast regional shipping resumed. But for smaller companies, especially exporters relying on just-in-time supply, the damage was already done. In Seattle, a tech firm waiting for specialized semiconductors from Japan was told delivery would be delayed indefinitely. In Busan, port officials rerouted 19 incoming ships due to tsunami risk protocols. In Anchorage, fuel prices at the pump rose by 9 cents in 48 hours, not due to shortage, but speculation. This was no longer a local disaster. Kamchatka had triggered a supply chain quake. And yet, even as economists and trade analysts began parsing the fallout, something more subtle emerged: trust. When routes break, contracts break. When data slows, decisions stall. When a ship doesn't dock, An entire chain of delivery collapses, from the raw material to the shelf. For multinational corporations already reeling from COVID-19, war and inflation, Kamchatka became the final warning. Redundancy wasn't just strategic, it was survival. Some adapted quickly. Amazon shifted Pacific fulfillment routes to southern lines. Maersk diverted its Trans-Asia shipments through the South China Sea, despite piracy risks. Japan accelerated an already delayed undersea cable reinforcement project, moving funds from its digital infrastructure budget. Russia declared parts of the Kamchatka coast a restricted maritime zone, citing ongoing seismic threats and damage assessments, but others lagged behind. Smaller nations, reliant on Russian fisheries or trade lanes, found themselves shut out. A Bangladeshi textile company importing specialized dye components via Vladivostok missed production deadlines. A Canadian lumber export deal, routed through the North Pacific, fell through. Each story small. Each story part of something much larger. Kamchatka had demonstrated what few boardrooms wanted to believe. There are still unknown risks, buried under sea, hidden in geography, waiting. And when they awaken, there is no time to plan. There is only time to react. That is the cost of global interdependence, when a tremor in one corner of the world sends shockwaves through contracts, economies, and livelihoods continents away. The irony? Many countries didn't even know their logistics relied on this route until it failed. That's the nature of hidden dependencies, invisible until they break. In the next section, we'll map the full extent of that break, tracking how Kamchatka's tremor moved through markets, policies, and people, and why it marks the beginning of a new global logistics paradigm. Because what happened off a remote volcanic coastline wasn't just a disaster, it was a revelation. In the 72 hours following the Kamchatka quake, the world's interconnected infrastructure began to fracture, not just physically, but economically and politically. What began as a seismic event beneath the Pacific became a cascading global disruption, unraveling critical trade patterns, forcing emergency policy shifts, and laying bare the vulnerability of high-stakes supply chains. And unlike past disasters, the tremors of Kamchatka didn't stop at the coastline. They traveled silently through spreadsheets, market algorithms, and international treaties. The energy sector was among the hardest hit. Japan, with its dependence on liquefied natural gas, LNG, particularly from Russian Far East terminals, felt the pressure first. LNG shipments that were en route when the quake struck were rerouted, delayed, or stopped entirely due to damage assessments and port closures. The country's energy ministry activated contingency protocols, directing utility companies to dip into strategic reserves while securing emergency cargoes from Qatar and Malaysia at inflated rates. This scramble caused ripple effects in energy spot markets. South Korea, which had expected to receive shipments from the same corridor, was forced into competitive bidding, pushing prices up further. The Tokyo Commodity Exchange reported a 19% surge in natural gas futures within 4 days, more volatile than any post-Fukushima spike. In Europe, the shock was felt with a delayed but no less severe impact. As LNG tankers bound for Asian markets were halted or rerouted, the global tanker circulation tightened. With fewer vessels available to service transatlantic LNG flows, shipments from the US to Europe saw contract bottlenecks. The EU, already on high alert due to reduced Russian pipeline exports in recent years, found itself in a precarious position. Energy security once again became a headline issue in Brussels. Emergency coordination meetings among member states discussed short-term conservation measures and price intervention tools. Germany, Poland, and Italy reported early signs of pressure on industrial energy demand. The Kamchatka quake had succeeded in reigniting a geopolitical fault line over energy, this time from the Pacific side. Meanwhile, the United States experienced its own wave of consequences. West Coast ports, particularly those in Alaska and Washington, saw a surge in redirected vessels. The Port of Seattle logged a 37% increase in unscheduled container arrivals, overwhelming customs processing and delaying inland freight movement. Rail companies struggled to absorb the shift. Trucking firms, already strained by labor shortages and high fuel costs, raised freight prices by 8 to 12% in response to volume surges. American businesses that relied on Pacific imports, from electronics to automotive parts, issued updated delivery forecasts. Companies like Tesla, which source critical battery components from Asia, noted moderate disruption in their supply logistics. Walmart and Target each reported temporary delays in restocking certain imported goods across the western US. At the same time, commodities markets responded with characteristic volatility. Beyond LNG, there was a sharp climb in seafood, aluminum and timber pricing. Resources either sourced near Kamchatka or affected by disrupted transport from Russian and East Asian ports. Aluminum contracts in particular spiked amid concerns over delayed shipments from Russia's eastern smelters. Analysts at JP Morgan described the event as a minor quake with major macroeconomic implications, noting that while the geographic epicenter was remote, its placement at a logistics crossroads made it disproportionately impactful. But it wasn't just goods and ships that were rerouted, it was data and digital infrastructure. The Kamchatka Peninsula is intersected by subsea fiber optic cables critical for digital communication between Asia and North America. Although backup routes existed, the disruption of two key undersea links created signal congestion across parallel lines. This led to bandwidth throttling for high-volume users, particularly financial institutions, cloud service providers, and telecoms. While residential users in most parts of the world noticed little change, backbone traffic providers initiated emergency rerouting protocols. Data centers in Tokyo, Seoul, and San Jose reported latency spikes and triggered protocol-based throttling to maintain network integrity. One unintended consequence of this slowdown: international banking transactions processed via SWIFT in the Asia-Pacific corridor experienced a 2 to 3 hour delay window during the peak of disruption. Cryptocurrency exchanges saw momentary arbitrage spreads widen between Asian and Western platforms, creating flash opportunities, but also revealing a vulnerability in digital finance. The crypto market's decentralized nature helped insulate it partially, but not entirely. Bitcoin transaction times rose. Ethereum gas fees surged. Network congestion wasn't just a technical issue, it became a financial one. On the geopolitical front, things were moving quickly behind closed doors. China, watching closely, initiated a regional supply chain audit across key sectors, especially rare earth minerals, medical supplies, and agricultural imports. Beijing state media described Kamchatka as a stress test of foreign dependency, pushing the government to accelerate logistics independence policies. The Northern Silk Route, an initiative to diversify Arctic shipping paths, was quietly revived in strategy briefings. Simultaneously, China dispatched oceanographic survey vessels to study seafloor shifts in the region under the guise of research, though analysts believe it was also a geopolitical signal. In Russia, the government moved into damage control mode, not only dealing with physical destruction in the Kamchatka Peninsula, but with the international perception of reliability. Moscow's foreign ministry held multiple press conferences emphasizing stability and continuity in maritime shipping. However, international insurers were unconvinced. Several raised premiums for voyages passing within 300 nautical miles of Kamchatka, citing risk reclassification. Russia's strategic Far East economic ambitions, long hampered by underinvestment, suffered a reputational blow, just as Moscow sought to boost trans-Pacific trade to counterbalance European sanctions. And in the global south, the effects trickled down more subtly, yet no less significantly. Vietnam's textile industry, heavily reliant on both energy imports and chemical inputs from China and Russia, reported delays in materials linked to container rerouting. Nigerian agricultural exporters noted missed shipping windows as bulk cargo routes were deprioritized in favor of high-value goods. Latin American ports like Callao in Peru and Valparaiso in Chile faced sudden reshuffling of maritime schedules, creating logistical jams at both arrival and export docks. The dominoes fell, slowly, silently, but undeniably. As these pieces moved, one central truth became clear to world leaders and market makers alike. Kamchatka was not a singular crisis. It was a distributed disruption, a decentralized shockwave that didn't need to destroy a city to cripple a system. It revealed how fragile our assumptions were about remote disasters and how fast disruption now moves. Not at the speed of boats or planes, but at the speed of bandwidth, contracts, and trust. By day 7, United Nations observers were calling for a global summit on disaster-proofing supply chains. The World Bank began re-evaluating loan risk assessments for coastal economies. and several G20 nations raised the possibility of standardizing early warning protocols, not just for life safety, but for economic continuity. Because in a hyper-connected world, resilience isn't just about staying alive, it's about staying operational. And as Kamchatka showed, the systems we depend on are only as strong as their quietest links. In the next part, we'll trace how the ripple effects of this disruption reshaped national priorities, forced long-term policy changes, and triggered a strategic rethink of global trade architecture from Silicon Valley to the Kremlin. As world leaders absorbed the cascading fallout of the Kamchatka disaster, a new urgency emerged. Less about responding to the moment, and more about reassessing the future. The quake had exposed not just infrastructure vulnerabilities, but strategic blind spots in national planning. It challenged assumptions about resilience, global trade reliance, and the stability of geopolitical supply corridors. In response, governments, corporations, and international institutions began reshaping their policies, often quietly but decisively. The United States was among the first to react with legislative intent. Within 10 days of the quake, a bipartisan group of senators introduced a proposal titled the Strategic Redundancy in Critical Supply Act. The bill, though hastily assembled, laid the groundwork for a broader strategy to onshore the production of key goods, semiconductors, rare earth elements, and pharmaceuticals. The logic was clear. If a single quake in Russia could stall US battery supply chains and destabilize energy shipping, then the nation was dangerously exposed. The Pentagon also weighed in, commissioning a rapid threat assessment on maritime choke points affected by the Kamchatka event. Its findings were sobering. Although the quake's epicenter was not near a US military installation, the disruption it caused in Allied logistics, particularly for Japan and South Korea, revealed tactical weaknesses. The report recommended diversifying naval refueling routes and reinforcing backup data cable links in the Pacific, some of which had been deprioritized due to budget constraints. Meanwhile, Japan escalated its own response dramatically. Tokyo announced a 1.2 trillion emergency investment package for infrastructure fortification across its northeastern coastal regions, including early warning upgrades, port hardening, and the expansion of LNG terminal redundancies. One striking policy shift came in its cybersecurity division. Kamchatka's impact on undersea data prompted government to fast-track its digital independence strategy, aiming to reduce Japan's reliance on shared subsea cable corridors and invest in AI-managed switching protocols. European leaders took longer to act, but their response was more sweeping. The European Commission unveiled a new white paper titled Shock-Proofing Europe Toward a Resilient Union. The document highlighted three major vulnerabilities exposed by Kamchatka: critical goods dependencies, maritime concentration, and data latency risks. In response, the EU proposed a multi-nation initiative to create resilience hubs, shared strategic reserves of food, energy, and medical supplies positioned along alternative trade routes. It also revived interest in Arctic rail links, particularly between Norway and Finland, as climate change continues to open navigable northern corridors. In Russia, the response was paradoxically aggressive and defensive. On one hand, Moscow sought to project control and recovery through state media, broadcasting footage of military engineers restoring roads and rebuilding port facilities in Petropavlovsk. On the other hand, it quietly began rerouting trade flows from the Far East to southern and western ports, minimizing future reliance on the exposed Pacific zone. This included expanding usage of the Northern Sea Route, a controversial Arctic shipping lane that Russia has promoted as a strategic alternative to the Suez and Panama canals. Simultaneously, Russian economists floated a proposal to establish a Pacific Contingency Exchange, an alternative trade and currency settlement system that would allow Pacific bordering nations to maintain exchange even in the event of Western system failure or infrastructure collapse. While still theoretical, it signaled Moscow's intent to use the crisis as a justification for accelerating its decoupling from Western financial systems. China's response, characteristically strategic, involved a quiet but significant pivot. Instead of public declarations, Beijing moved swiftly behind the scenes. It launched a classified audit of all imports routed through Russian Far East corridors, instructed SOEs to assess contingency stockpiles, and accelerated the construction of inland logistics corridors, such as the China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan Railway, as alternative export paths. Notably, China's state-run oil giant CNPC shifted 2 shipping contracts from Arctic LNG-2 to Qatari suppliers, citing logistical volatility in the northern Pacific. Corporations, too, were not idle. Tech giants like Apple and Samsung began exploring risk-distributed manufacturing, a model that spreads critical production across multiple countries rather than concentrating it in one location. Global logistics firms such as FedEx and DHL restructured their route algorithms to de-emphasize earthquake-prone corridors, factoring geological risk into their cost models. Amazon added a new line item to its quarterly report: geophysical disruption sensitivity. For investors, this was a clear signal that physical infrastructure shocks were now material financial risks. Insurance companies, perhaps the most directly impacted, responded with sweeping recalibrations. Reinsurers like Swiss Re and Munich Re revised their risk zones across the Pacific Rim, increasing premiums for cargo ships, data cables, and coastal warehousing facilities near tectonic boundaries. A new category, seismic supply volatility, was created in commercial coverage plans, reflecting the compound threat of natural disasters to global trade systems. Corporate clients were advised to diversify their suppliers not just by country, but by tectonic stability. Amid these policy shifts, the public narrative began to change. Media outlets that initially focused on the death toll and immediate damage turned to broader questions. How fragile is our global economy, really? Why were we so unprepared for a disaster in a place no one was watching? What other silent nodes are out there, essential yet invisible? Think tanks and university research centers launched symposiums and webinars titled The Kamchatka Effect, discussing everything from global governance to digital sovereignty. The event had become a case study, not just in disaster response, but in systemic fragility. A Harvard Business School professor summed it up bluntly in a viral post: Kamchatka was a glitch in the matrix, but the glitch wasn't the quake, it was our blindness to it. This recognition began seeping into public policy frameworks. In India, the Niti Aayog announced a new division on geo-economic contingency planning. In Brazil, the Ministry of Transport initiated risk assessments for Atlantic-facing port redundancy. In Kenya, regional leaders discussed building inland rail links as fallback routes in case coastal trade was disrupted. Everyone, everywhere, seemed to be asking the same question: if Kamchatka could shake the world, what else could? The most profound shift, however, was philosophical. The idea of resilience had changed. Before, it meant resistance, preventing bad things from happening. Now it meant absorption, bending without breaking, adapting fast, recovering smarter. Kamchatka had shown that even the most advanced systems couldn't stop disruption, but they could, if properly designed, transform disruption into evolution. As we continue in the next section, we'll follow how Kamchatka's aftershocks reached into the private sector, triggered innovation in tech and transport, and sparked the next generation of resilience planning across industries, from aerospace to agriculture. As governments reeled and restructured, the private sector, nimble, data-driven, and often quicker to adapt, began reimagining its future in real time. Kamchatka's shock wasn't just about delayed shipments or broken fiber cables. It became a mirror, revealing systemic vulnerabilities and prompting corporations to innovate under pressure. What emerged from this pressure was a sweeping acceleration of resilience-based design, decentralized infrastructure, and predictive modeling, led not by government mandates, but by survival instinct. At the heart of this transformation was the logistics industry. Multinational logistics giants like Maersk, CMA CGM, and Evergreen began to overhaul their route optimization strategies. Kamchatka had introduced a new variable: seismic probability. Instead of relying purely on cost efficiency and fuel economy, routing algorithms now included geophysical risk weighting. Satellite data integration allowed these companies to develop real-time risk maps of the Pacific corridor. If an earthquake cluster was detected along the Ring of Fire, certain vessels would be automatically rerouted, regardless of the added distance. Machine learning systems recalibrated delivery forecasts based on tremor patterns and weather simulations. In other words, the industry stopped thinking reactively and began designing preemptively. Air cargo, long seen as a high-cost last resort, found renewed importance. FedEx and UPS reported a sharp uptick in demand for Asia to North America air routes during the Kamchatka disruption. In response, they fast-tracked the deployment of next-generation aircraft capable of trans-Pacific non-stop hauls. Boeing's production division launched a targeted marketing campaign around its 777X freighter, framing it as geo-disruption proof. For critical industries like pharma and semiconductors, the added cost of air cargo was justified by the reliability it offered amid maritime volatility. On the ground, warehousing strategy underwent a quiet revolution. Major retailers, especially in North America and Southeast Asia, began implementing multi-nodal fulfillment networks. This approach created overlapping layers of regional micro-distribution centers, each capable of acting independently in the event of supply chain fracture. Walmart's Asia-Pacific division partnered with local logistics firms to set up inland cold storage hubs away from tsunami-prone coastlines. Similarly, Alibaba's Cainiao logistics arm launched a proprietary platform called Spine, which used blockchain to trace every component of a shipment's journey, making it possible to pinpoint exactly where delays or vulnerabilities originated. The most significant pivot, however, came in tech and data infrastructure. Tech companies had long understood the fragility of undersea cables, but Kamchatka made the threat real. Google and Meta, which co-own vast subsea internet infrastructure, convened emergency engineering task forces after the quake. Within weeks, Google Cloud announced the expansion of its Starlink redundancy gateway, a high-altitude satellite-based internet failover network in collaboration with SpaceX. Meta, meanwhile, tested a decentralized cloud storage model based on blockchain-led data redundancy, allowing user data to be split, encrypted, and hosted across multiple physical jurisdictions. In Japan and South Korea, telecommunications firms launched what they called seismic-aware architecture. Essentially, their servers and data centers were programmed to pre-route or buffer critical information packets when regional tremors crossed a certain magnitude. This meant fewer disruptions in national banking, traffic systems, and hospital records, even if the cables were severed. Agriculture, often the slowest sector to digitize, experienced an unexpected leap. Kamchatka's interruption of seafood and fertilizer shipments caused acute shortages in East Asia. This forced agribusinesses to adopt predictive stocking algorithms, tools that could model climate, port status, and regional risk to optimize input procurement. In Thailand, rice exporters began using satellite heat maps to predict when coastal shipping delays might occur, rerouting product toward land-based routes through Laos and Vietnam. The agri-food tech industry, which had spent years trying to get traction with investors, suddenly found itself center stage. The insurance industry, often behind the curve in digital transformation, took a major step forward. To quantify seismic trade risk, several leading reinsurers began piloting black swan indices, statistical models that assigned disruption probability to geo-economic zones based on natural disaster history, trade volume, and political stability. These tools, once academic in nature, were commercialized at record speed. They became essential not just for underwriters, but for CFOs and supply chain managers making policy decisions. Even small businesses, far from Kamchatka and outside major trade lanes, weren't untouched. Etsy sellers in Texas noticed that bamboo suppliers in China were late. A coffee roaster in Berlin learned that his Indonesian beans had been delayed by 2 weeks, not due to weather, but because the shipping container had been rerouted twice due to port disruptions triggered by Kamchatka. The ripple effects weren't always catastrophic, but they were everywhere. They were deeply human. Education and training followed. Business schools began updating their MBA programs to include global fragility modeling. Supply chain management textbooks suddenly featured Kamchatka as a case study alongside the 2011 Tohoku quake and the 2021 Suez Canal blockage. Online certification programs sprang up teaching resilience planning, decentralized logistics, and disaster-smart procurement. The workforce wasn't just adapting, it was evolving. Meanwhile, in Silicon Valley, a new wave of startups emerged. Startups designed not to create the next social app, but to solve the problems Kamchatka had unearthed. One AI firm, based in Palo Alto, launched a service that predicts secondary trade disruptions based on initial earthquake parameters, helping companies get ahead of the shockwave. Another startup in Singapore offered an app that alerts retailers when their upstream suppliers are located in high-risk geophysical zones. A third, in Berlin, built an open-source global supply map powered by crowdsourced shipping data, enabling real-time transparency for any consumer to see where their product is and what's blocking it. Culturally, too, the quake left a mark. Consumers began to ask deeper questions. Where does this come from? How far did it travel? How is it affected by global events? Origin transparency became a marketing asset. Companies that could prove resilient sourcing, sustainable, local, or risk-distributed, found themselves with a competitive edge. Environmental and social governance (ESG) reports began including disaster exposure metrics, and investors started pressuring firms to build not just green supply chains, but resilient ones. The lesson was simple but revolutionary. Efficiency is not the opposite of fragility. It often depends on it. And Kamchatka broke that illusion. As we move into the next part, we'll look beyond industry and enterprise, toward the people. How did this global disruption impact workers, families, coastal communities, and fragile economies that had no voice in the supply chain, but bore the brunt of its failure? Because when systems crack, it's always the human layer that bleeds first. While headlines focused on global trade metrics, container ships, and billion-dollar market moves, the human toll of Kamchatka's disruption unfolded in quieter, more fragile corners of the world. Behind the globalized machinery of commerce are people, workers on docks, farmers in rural fields, children waiting for medicine, elders reliant on regular shipments of essential goods. When the system broke, it was these human layers that absorbed the shock, not with fanfare, but with fatigue, confusion, and growing uncertainty. Start with the port workers. In Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk, cleanup crews worked 12-hour shifts to assess structural damage, clear debris, and reroute traffic. Dozens of dock workers were temporarily housed in emergency shelters due to housing instability caused by quake-related tremors. In Alaska and Washington, longshoremen found themselves scrambling to unload unexpected cargo as vessels diverted from closed ports. There were no extra workers, no extended deadlines, just compressed timelines and more risk. One Seattle crane operator described it this way: "It wasn't a wave that hit us, it was a calendar that collapsed." In rural Vietnam, the story was quieter. Fertilizer deliveries scheduled from Russia's Pacific ports were delayed or cancelled. Rice farmers already squeezed by climate variability were forced to use lower-grade local alternatives. Yield projections dropped. Some small farms operating on thin margins pivoted to less exportable crops, effectively removing themselves from international markets they'd relied on for years. In the Philippines, delays in imported antibiotics from China and India, rerouted due to shipping disruptions, left hospitals and clinics scrambling. A health coordinator in Mindanao reported that supplies meant for March arrived in May. Africa's indirect exposure proved no less severe. In Kenya, flour exporters dependent on precise timing found their shipments delayed at sea, causing whole container loads to spoil. Many of these farms employ women in rural communities, and cancelled contracts meant cancelled wages. In Nigeria, the cost of imported wheat rose sharply as maritime insurance rates climbed. Bread prices followed. The World Food Programme noted price surges in over 20 nations within 2 weeks of Kamchatka's disruption, primarily due to port compression, where fewer available shipping slots created bidding wars for cargo space. Then there were the migrants and diaspora communities. In California's Central Valley, Filipino agricultural workers rely heavily on remittances and supply chains that connect their families back home. When money transfers slowed due to latency issues in Asian banking networks, and when goods shipments were delayed, these communities felt it both emotionally and economically. In South Korea, guest workers from Southeast Asia, already under pressure from high living costs, saw their remittance options delayed and their food imports affected. A Cambodian student in Seoul noted, "It's not that we can't survive a delay, it's that everything in our lives is connected to something fragile." Education was not immune. Universities in Australia and the US reported delays in student visa processing and document authentication services due to data flow disruptions between embassies and regional offices in Asia. Online international programs based in Korea and Japan experienced brief outages or curriculum delays as learning platforms failed to sync updates through disrupted digital lines. Students from developing nations whose access to online education had already been limited found themselves further cut off, not by affordability, but by geography and infrastructure breakdowns. In the fishing villages of Kamchatka itself, life changed dramatically. The quake and tsunami disrupted spawning patterns and destroyed small-scale fisheries that relied on predictable seasonal harvests. With fuel prices soaring and fish routes disturbed, many turned to local barter or subsistence models. The government promised subsidies, but locals knew from experience how slowly such promises moved. One fisherman, interviewed by a regional Russian journalist, said, "We live at the edge of the earth. When the world shakes, we fall first." Even in wealthy nations, the disruption found ways to squeeze the working class. Truck drivers in Oregon and British Columbia were asked to work double shifts to cover container backlogs without additional pay due to cost pressures on logistics firms. In Germany, small manufacturing shops dependent on just-in-time parts from Asia had to furlough workers when inventory ran out. In São Paulo, Uber Eats couriers reported longer delivery routes and higher fuel costs as imported fuel additives arrived late. Perhaps most poignant were the mental health echoes. Global disasters don't just move goods, they move anxiety. In regions far from Kamchatka, people felt the tremors emotionally. Food prices up, medications missing, delivery delays, unexplained outages, all without visible destruction. Psychologists reported a rise in what they dubbed invisible crisis stress, a low-grade, constant worry rooted not in what people could see, but in what they couldn't fix. Parents in urban South Korea, tech workers in Silicon Valley, rural elders in Bangladesh, all experienced the same creeping question. If this much can change from one quake, what next? NGOs rushed to respond. Organizations like Doctors Without Borders reallocated mobile clinics to coastal regions in the Pacific Rim with known healthcare fragility. Tech Access Global, a non-profit that distributes low-cost connectivity tools, accelerated delivery of satellite modems to areas with unreliable infrastructure. But scale was a challenge. For every area reached, another went dark. Kamchatka had not been a major global disaster in traditional terms. There was no war, no citywide flattening, no nuclear risk. But in the networked age, scale isn't measured in ruins. It's measured in interruptions and their cumulative human toll. By the end of week 4, global media attention had largely moved on. Other headlines had emerged. But in coastal Bangladesh, a family still waited for a boatload of rice. In Madagascar, teachers still struggled with textbook delays. In Yakutsk, Russia, a grandmother still walked 2 hours to charge her phone because her neighborhood's substation had failed in the quake's aftershock. The system had recovered, but the people were still catching up. In the final part, we'll pull together everything Kamchatka revealed: the fragility of progress, the illusion of distance, and the urgent need for a new global strategy. One that sees resilience not just as engineering, but as empathy, equity, and foresight. Because the next disruption is already forming. And this time, we have no excuse to be unprepared. There is a strange kind of silence that comes after disruption. Not the silence of resolution, but of reckoning, of looking back and realizing how much of what we called stability was, in truth, luck. The Kamchatka earthquake didn't just crack the ocean floor. It cracked the illusion that global systems were resilient by default. It proved that a shift in one remote peninsula could set off economic, digital, and humanitarian ripples across continents. And perhaps most importantly, it forced us to ask, what now? For policymakers, the answer must begin with redefinition. Resilience is no longer about returning to the status quo. That model is dead. What Kamchatka taught us is that resilience must be layered, distributed, and human-centered. It's not just about securing ports or building stronger cables. It's about designing systems that expect disruption and adapt to it with grace, not panic. It's about backup plans for backup plans. About linking climate models with trade forecasts. About knowing that an 8.8 quake in a place most people can't pronounce could reroute your medication, delay your paycheck, or destabilize your region's food supply. This is the new reality. We need coordinated international protocols that go beyond disaster relief. Kamchatka has made it clear, economic shockwaves need their own early warning systems. Just as tsunamis are tracked in the deep ocean, we need digital buoys that alert supply chains before they fail, before a single broken cable stalls a continent's data flow. We need satellite monitoring of geopolitical trade risks, not just for governments, but accessible to businesses, schools, and even farmers. But beyond the tools, we need trust. The quake revealed how quickly misinformation can travel in the vacuum of delayed data. When ships were rerouted, rumors of conflict arose. When internet speeds dropped, speculation spiked about cyber attacks. When prices surged, blame shifted to the wrong actors. Crisis-ready communication must become a core pillar of global planning. A shared language of facts, timelines, and cause-effect clarity that travels faster than panic, faster than speculation. Corporations, too, must act differently, not just reactively, but preemptively and ethically. Supply chains can no longer be optimized solely for profit. Shareholder returns are meaningless if your global network collapses under pressure. Kamchatka showed that ethical sourcing, local redundancies, and decentralized manufacturing aren't ESG extras. They are survival infrastructure. It's time companies invest in them with the same seriousness they give to AI or marketing, because the next shock won't ask if they're ready. Consumers play a role as well. The choices we make, the brands we support, the questions we ask, the transparency we demand create pressure. Kamchatka made it clear, the age of passive consumption is over. We need to become informed participants in global systems. We need to ask where things come from, how they get here, who gets hurt when they don't. And we must not forget the human layer. Every port is a neighborhood. Every trade lane touches a life. Kamchatka's ripple affected people who will never be named in market reports or policy briefings. A nurse in Hokkaido whose supplies ran late. A student in Nairobi who missed a lesson. A trucker in Anchorage who didn't sleep for 3 days. Systems must be built to protect these lives, not just the numbers they support. At the geopolitical level, Kamchatka may one day be remembered as a turning point, not because it changed borders or collapsed economies, but because it revealed what had always been true, that in the 21st century, remoteness is a myth. In a world stitched together by fiber optics, satellite pings, and transoceanic freight, there is no such thing as somewhere else. There is only here, and how soon here feels the shock of there. The next global disruption may not begin with a quake. It may be a flood, a cyber attack, a political collapse, a viral outbreak. But whatever form it takes, Kamchatka has left behind a blueprint, not of destruction, but of revelation. A warning siren from the Earth itself that we must think wider, plan deeper, and care more. Because in the end, survival is not just about structures or systems, it's about wisdom, foresight, and the willingness to change before we are forced to. And so we close this report not with fear, but with clarity. Kamchatka was a mirror. Now that we've seen our reflection, the only question left is, what will we do with it? If you found this analysis urgent and valuable, subscribe to Crisis Lens, where we decode the disasters that shape our world and reveal the systems behind the shockwaves. Stay informed, stay ready, and remember, the Earth may move, but how we respond defines everything.